Welcome to Medieval, and thanks for joining us. I'm Joshua Potts, and the aim of my podcast is to make the incredible tales of the Middle Ages accessible and enjoyable for the general listener. The idea behind Medieval is to view life and society in the Middle Ages from the eyes of a person living in the era. Before I tell you more about the podcast, I'd like you to picture the Dark Ages in your head. What pictures does that phrase conjure up? Disease, conflict, misery, famine? Now, what would you think if I told you that the Middle Ages gave birth to some of the very best art in the entire world, a huge advancement in technology and war, and the most important foundations for European nations and politics in the modern day? It may surprise you, but medieval times were absolutely not dark, and as you will soon discover, the Middle Ages was one of the most fascinating eras in all of history. For that reason, I promise not to use the term Dark Ages in any future episodes because I don't believe it is accurate. In the first few episodes, we'll take a look at the shape of Europe following the fall of Rome and then progress into the early Middle Ages. I'll give a brief description of the world we start our journey in, but I don't want to spoil too much as we'll learn a lot about medieval life along the way. You can look forward to hearing about siege engines, barbarian tribes, rebellions, cathedrals, and castles. There will be dark and mysterious tales, brutal battles, and sibling rivalry. In contrast, we'll talk about magnificent art, construction, and music. The whole chronological journey will take us from 476 AD, the commonly referred to date for the end of the Western Roman Empire, to 1453 and the sacking of Constantinople, the point at which the Middle Ages generally came to a close. And in the last episode of our series, you can expect to learn about the Wars of the Roses and the Reformation, analyzing what led to the modern age and why our favorite 1,000-year-long period ended. There are countless amazing stories from the Middle Ages, and those aren't just the same old King Arthur and William Wallace legends. From the tale of a boy called Stephen that launched his own crusade, to the time when a band of Christian soldiers ambushed Muslims from caves in the Cantabrian Mountains. These events will give you a real idea of what it was like to live in the medieval times. In order to keep things fun, the style of medieval will be simple and understandable. If you decide to stick around, I'll show you the good, bad, and the ugly of the Middle Ages, with a special emphasis on storytelling and perspective. There will be topics of chivalry and medieval combat later in the podcast. Whilst I love military history and would like to focus on every single battle, I don't think that would be plausible or sensible. Why? Well, the purpose of the podcast is to debunk some of the common myths about the medieval ages, and among these is the misconception that the medieval times were all about castles and knights in shining armor, which they were definitely not. If I were to only cover battles and conflicts, I would be backing up that myth, and that's certainly not something I want to do on this podcast. Because I want to keep the information on medieval up to date and relevant, I will be trying to use as many pieces of useful, recent research to back up each topic. Still, I want to keep things fairly easy, so I won't dive too deep into the complex research. I'd like to make it possible for people to learn about these times without having to study them academically. I don't believe history should be boring. So that's simply why I'm starting Medieval, and I'd appreciate it if you stayed for our next few episodes, because I'm sure you'll really enjoy them. What you take away from this podcast is completely up to you, but what I want you to know is that you don't have to hate medieval history, and you probably won't forget the tales I'll tell you for a long time to come. But before you go, I'd like to let you know how you can support the show. If you'd like to keep the show running and ad-free, then consider becoming a member on Patreon. Patreons have access to bonus episodes and articles, sneak peeks, shoutouts, and other rewards. A big thanks goes to Mark Clover, who has signed up to be Medieval's first patron. I'm immensely grateful to everyone who helps out, but if you don't have the money right now, don't feel pressured to contribute. Should you have any questions you'd like me to answer, please email them to medievalpodcast@outlook.com or contact me through my website. That's it for today, but I'll see you again for the first episode in our series, Barbarian Europe.